The night had a chill that seemed unnatural, a biting wind that whispered through the empty streets and rattled the shutters of the grand mansion, perched atop the hill. Inside, a single candle flickered in the vast, gilded hall, casting long shadows that danced across walls adorned with ancient portraits. The faces of long-dead ancestors, their eyes painted with a hint of accusation, seemed to watch as the guests arrived. Laughter echoed faintly, a polished, rehearsed sound, carrying the scent of expensive perfumes, roasted meats, and the faint tang of candle wax. But beneath the laughter, there was something unplaceable, a tension that prickled the skin, a sense that this night was not like the others. The invitations had promised opulence and spectacle, and the guests had arrived eager to partake in a display of wealth and refinement. Yet, from the moment they stepped through the massive oak doors, a strange unease settled over them. The servants moved with a precision that felt almost mechanical, silent except for the clatter of silverware, their eyes downcast as though aware of some unspoken dread. In the corners, shadows gathered like dark spectators, and the firelight seemed to shiver and bend unnaturally. As the banquet began, the music of a distant harpsichord floated through the halls, sweet and inviting, yet strangely hollow. The table groaned under the weight of exotic dishes, fruits imported from distant lands, and meats prepared in ways that defied ordinary taste. Glasses sparkled with wine that caught the candlelight like liquid rubies. At first glance, the scene was perfection itself. Elegance, sophistication, the kind of spectacle that could impress even the most discerning aristocrat. But the perfection felt fragile, a veneer masking something far more sinister beneath. Whispers of past tragedies lingered in the air. Local legend had long murmured of this house, a family cursed, some said, others dismissed as superstition. Tales of madness, sudden deaths, and whispered deals with darker forces threaded through the walls as subtly as the scent of burning wicks. And tonight, the mansion seemed alive with anticipation, as if it, too, were waiting for the night's events to unfold. The guests, unaware of the history wrapped around them like chains, laughed and toasted, unknowingly stepping closer to a night that would shatter their very understanding of civility. By the time the first course was served, the audience is meant to feel the tension thickening, a cinematic pause where every glance, every shadow, every muffled footstep hints that something is profoundly wrong. The laughter feels brittle, the clinking of glasses almost mocking, and the firelight, dancing across faces, exaggerates expressions until horror and delight seem inseparable. In these opening moments, the story seduces the viewer, drawing them into a world of grandeur, secrecy, and creeping dread, leaving them asking a single question. How could a night so beautiful, so intoxicating, end in unimaginable horror? The mansion stood as a monument to opulence, its very stones whispering stories of power, wealth, and decadence. Every brick seemed laid with intent, each corridor designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Outside, gardens stretched like labyrinths, trimmed hedges forming patterns that spoke of meticulous control, yet the creeping ivy hinted at nature's quiet rebellion against human pride. Lanterns cast pools of golden light on the gravel paths, flickering like spirits guiding or warning the guests along the way. From the first glance, it was clear this was a place where nothing was accidental. Every detail was curated to inspire awe and, perhaps, a hint of unease. Inside, the grandeur became overwhelming. High ceilings soared above frescoed murals, depicting scenes of hunting, conquest, and feasts that mirrored the one about to unfold. Massive chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, dripping crystals that reflected the candlelight in fractured rainbows. Rich tapestries lined the walls, illustrating ancestral triumphs. Yet the faces of the painted nobles often seemed almost alive, their eyes following visitors, whispering silent admonitions. This was a house built to impress, to assert dominance, and to contain secrets, some whispered, some hidden behind locked doors, others lurking in the very air the guests breathed. The era itself was one of excess, of opulent displays meant to awe and intimidate. Banquets were more than meals. They were performances of power, where alliances were forged over the clinking of glasses and grudges were buried beneath platters of roasted meats. Guests arrived dressed in their finest, their jeweled adornments glittering in the candlelight, masks of civility concealing curiosity, greed, and envy. The social dynamics were complex. Some were rivals seeking advantage. Others were sycophants desperate for favor. Beneath the polished exterior of etiquette and laughter lay undercurrents of tension, subtle gestures, and unspoken threats, each as lethal as a dagger hidden in velvet. Yet even amidst this cultivated perfection, the mansion exuded a sense of otherness, a subtle suggestion that it was more than a mere house. Some rooms were avoided, said to carry echoes of past tragedies. A chamber where a guest had vanished centuries ago, a hall where whispers of arguments had turned to screams, a stairwell rumored to creak on its own, announcing unseen footsteps. The servants moved silently through these spaces, their eyes alert yet unseeing, shadows themselves in a house that seemed to breathe with memory. Every corner hinted at a history too dark to be recorded, a lineage steeped in whispers and rumors, each more unsettling than the last. The cultural and historical context of the period only amplified the tension. Aristocratic families wielded their influence like weapons, their wealth allowing them to flout rules, bend justice, and manipulate events in ways ordinary people could scarcely imagine. This banquet was not simply a meal. It was an exhibition of power, a demonstration of control over not just food, but over minds, alliances, and the fragile social order. The stakes were invisible yet monumental. A misstep in behavior, a slight insult, could trigger consequences far beyond mere embarrassment. The audience begins to sense that beneath the gilded surface, human instincts, greed, jealousy, desire, were simmering like a hidden fire, waiting for the smallest spark. The mansion itself became a character in the story, its design both alluring and suffocating. Staircases twisted like the inner workings of a mind obsessed with perfection, doors opened to reveal hidden alcoves, and windows reflected distorted images of those inside. Shadows pooled unnaturally in corners, and the flickering light seemed to anticipate movements before they happened. Outside, the grounds stretched into darkness, a void that contrasted sharply with the brilliance of the interior, a reminder that civilization was always fragile, balanced precariously against the unknown. As the guests prepared to enter the banquet hall, the audience is invited to feel the weight of history pressing down, the combined aura of wealth, secrecy, and looming disaster. Every step through the mansion carries echoes of previous misdeeds, unspoken family rivalries, and long-forgotten curses. The atmosphere is thick, not just with anticipation, but with the subtle, almost imperceptible dread that something is amiss. The scene is set, a house of grandeur, a night of excess, and a social world teetering on the edge of chaos. In these moments, the tension between beauty and danger is palpable, leaving the viewer suspended, teetering between fascination and fear, ready for the darkness to descend. The host of the evening was a man whose reputation preceded him, though much of it was wrapped in whispers and half-truths. To the world, he was a paragon of sophistication, impeccably dressed, fluent in multiple languages, and a connoisseur of art, music, and fine cuisine. To those closer to him, however, there were cracks in the polished facade, moments of sudden rage, glimpses of cruelty that he carefully masked behind charm and wit. His lineage was as storied as the mansion itself, a family that had risen through cunning, ruthlessness, and a willingness to exploit every advantage. Tales of ancestral ambition and dark bargains clung to his name like shadows, making his presence both magnetic and unsettling. Born into privilege, but raised with an iron discipline, the host had learned early that appearances were everything. Every gesture, Every smile, every phrase was calculated to maintain the illusion of control. Yet behind closed doors, he was said to harbor obsessions most could scarcely imagine. A fascination with human behavior under extreme duress, a study of fear, greed, and desire that went beyond mere curiosity. Some historians later speculated that these obsessions were inherited, a twisted legacy passed down through generations, each host of the mansion adding layers of secrecy, manipulation, and subtle menace. Guests often described a feeling of being observed, as if the host could see not just their actions, but the thoughts they tried to conceal. There were rumors, some dismissed, others persistently told, that the host had a private collection of objects and artifacts with dark histories. Ancient tomes bound in leather, jars filled with substances that seemed to defy explanation, and curious relics acquired from distant lands. Each item suggested a fascination with power, mortality, and the limits of human endurance. Scholars later debated whether he merely collected curiosities or whether he actively experimented with them, testing boundaries that society would not condone. Within the mansion, these objects were carefully arranged, displayed like trophies, each one hinting at the potential for danger lurking behind the veneer of refinement. Yet the host was not simply a collector of objects. He was a manipulator of people. He understood the dynamics of tension and desire in ways that made his banquets legendary. Every seat carefully assigned, every toast and conversation choreographed to provoke subtle unease. Rivalries simmered beneath polite laughter, secrets were tested, and allegiances were examined. Even the most confident guests often left the room feeling as though they had been participants in an intricate game, unaware of the rules and fearful of losing in ways they could not yet imagine. Stories of his temper were widespread, though rarely confirmed. One guest, years later, recalled a fleeting glance during a previous gathering, the host's eyes darkening, a smile twitching unnaturally, and the room's atmosphere shifting from warmth to icy tension within moments. Such experiences were often dismissed at the time as imagination or nerves, but they created a pervasive aura around him, an understanding that beneath charm lay unpredictability, and beneath civility lay potential violence. The mansion itself seemed to respond to his moods, corridors darkening at his scowl, shadows lingering longer in his presence, as if the house itself recognized his power. The host's relationships with his guests were complex. Some were loyal allies, bound by mutual benefit and shared secrets. Others were rivals, drawn into the orbit of his influence, manipulated subtly to reveal their vulnerabilities. Invitations to his banquets were coveted and feared in equal measure. An invitation implied honor, but also exposure. The audience begins to sense that, for all his sophistication, there was an underlying hunger, an almost primal need to observe the unraveling of human civility, to watch how those who considered themselves superior behaved when confronted with extreme circumstances. Even his private life was shrouded in rumor. Whispers told of hidden rooms, secret passageways, and nocturnal rituals conducted in shadowed corners of the mansion. Some accounts suggested he had dabbled in the occult, not as a believer, but as a manipulator of fear and superstition. Whether true or exaggerated, the effect was the same, a chilling sense that the host's intellect and ambition were matched only by his capacity for cruelty. Guests approached him with caution, aware that a misplaced word or careless glance could have consequences far beyond embarrassment. By the time the banquet was about to begin, the host had become more than a man. He was a force, a presence whose influence stretched across the room and into the minds of those present. His charisma drew people in, but his aura kept them uneasy, always aware that this night, unlike any other, could reveal the darkest aspects of human nature. For the viewer, this section sets the stage for the convergence of personality, history, and malevolence. A man who could orchestrate not just a gathering, but an unraveling, a host whose secrets and obsessions would transform a night of splendor into a descent into horror. The invitations were more than mere letters. They were works of art, embossed with gold filigree and sealed with the host's personal crest, a symbol that spoke of lineage, wealth, and quiet menace. Delivered by footmen in midnight blue livery, they carried not only the promise of opulence, but also an unspoken weight. To receive one was an honor, a mark of status, yet beneath the delicate paper and elegant calligraphy lay subtle messages. The order of seating suggested alliances, rivalries, and hidden hierarchies, while the choice of wording hinted at expectations and the consequences of failure to comply. Each guest, upon opening their envelope, experienced a mixture of excitement and apprehension, unaware that the paper they held was as much a key as it was a warning. The guests themselves were a carefully curated mix of personalities. Some were ambitious aristocrats, their eyes always calculating the next political advantage. Others were artists and scholars, drawn by curiosity and the allure of the mansion's legendary gatherings. A few were distant relatives, whose ties to the host were more blood than loyalty, carrying secrets that could unravel reputations if revealed. Even among them, the air was thick with tension. Alliances were fragile, suspicions buried just beneath polite conversation. Each guest arrived with personal motivations and unspoken fears, their behaviors primed to be observed, tested, and perhaps manipulated by the host. Superstition and rumor colored the arrival. In the days leading up to the banquet, the local village buzzed with speculation. Some spoke of the mansion as cursed, its lineage tainted by deeds too terrible to record in official histories. Others whispered that the host had dabbled in forbidden practices, that the previous gatherings had ended in madness, sudden disappearances, or unexplained deaths. For the guests, these stories were a mix of thrill and dread, an intoxicating cocktail that heightened anticipation. They could not help but feel that attending this night meant stepping into a space where the ordinary rules of civility and morality might not apply. The invitations themselves contained subtle omens. Each was delivered on a day of significance, some aligned with astrological events, others with anniversaries of past tragedies. The wording included archaic phrases and veiled references that would strike only the most attentive guest with a sense of unease. Historians later speculated that these elements were intentional, designed to unsettle, to introduce a psychological tension that would grow as the night progressed. Even the order of arrival was meticulously planned, forcing certain individuals to cross paths in ways that would reignite old rivalries or provoke subtle humiliation. The host had orchestrated not just a gathering, but a careful psychological experiment, using the invitations as the first instruments of control. Upon arrival, the guests were greeted by the mansion itself, its doors opening to reveal the grandeur within, yet the interior hinted at something darker. Flickering candles cast exaggerated shadows, and the echo of footfalls in the marble hallways gave the impression of being followed. The scent of polished wood mingled with faint traces of incense, creating an almost intoxicating effect. Each guest, aware of the mansion's history and the host's reputation, could not entirely shake the sense that the walls themselves were alive, watching, assessing. It was as if the mansion had become an extension of the host's will, a silent accomplice in the orchestration of the evening's events. The guests exchanged polite greetings, their smiles strained, their hands slightly trembling with a mix of excitement and apprehension. They noticed the careful placement of paintings, the positioning of statues, the alignment of mirrors that reflected not just the room, but the subtle interactions of those present. Each detail seemed designed to provoke thought, to heighten awareness, to unsettle. Small omens, the flicker of candlelight, the unexpected chill in the hallway, the whisper of curtains in the breeze, worked in concert with the mansion and the invitations themselves, creating an atmosphere thick with anticipation and latent fear. By the time the final guest stepped into the banquet hall, the stage was set. The invitations had done their work. Curiosity had been stoked, tensions heightened, and the guests were now fully immersed in a world where decorum, secrecy, and fear were intertwined. The audience senses that the night will not progress according to expectation. The carefully constructed veneer of civility is fragile, and the subtle warnings embedded in the invitations have already begun to influence behavior, planting the seeds of paranoia, suspicion, and ultimately, chaos. Every glance, every whispered word, and every hesitation becomes meaningful, as if the guests themselves are unwitting actors in a dark and carefully scripted drama. The banquet hall was a vision of grandeur that seemed almost unreal, a room where wealth and artistry collided in a spectacle designed to overwhelm the senses. Massive chandeliers hung from ceilings frescoed with scenes of gods, huntsmen, and legendary feasts, their crystals fracturing candlelight into dazzling rainbows that danced across the polished floor. Tables stretched the length of the hall, draped in deep crimson cloths embroidered with gold thread, each setting meticulously arranged, silver cutlery gleaming, porcelain plates etched with intricate patterns, and goblets catching the flicker of firelight like molten gemstones. The aroma of the food was intoxicating. Herbs and spices from distant lands, roasted meats so succulent they seemed to promise indulgence beyond imagination, and desserts sculpted into shapes that rivaled art itself. At first glance, the scene was perfect. Guests were seated according to the host's careful design, their placement deliberate, meant to stir subtle dynamics of power, envy, and rivalry. Every smile, every bow, and every toast was an enactment of social theater. Yet beneath the surface, tension hung like a storm cloud, invisible yet undeniable. Eyes darted between neighbors, measuring, calculating, and silently questioning intentions. The host moved through the room with effortless grace, his gaze sharp, catching even the smallest flicker of discomfort. Laughter rang out, polished and rehearsed, but for those attuned to the mansion's darker pulse, it carried a brittle edge, a fragile veneer over something far more unsettling. The first course arrived, a parade of dishes that seemed designed as much to impress as to nourish. Guests marveled at the exotic ingredients, birds stuffed with spices unfamiliar to European palates, fruits preserved in techniques lost to time, and sauces so complex they defied description. Each dish was presented with ceremony, servers gliding silently, eyes downcast yet alert, as if performing a ritual. The audience is drawn into the sensory opulence, the taste, the texture, the almost hypnotic visual display. But amid this spectacle, subtle signs of tension emerged. A guest's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his goblet. A whispered exchange carried more venom than politeness. A smile flickered and vanished too quickly. The banquet, beautiful and intoxicating, began to reveal the first hints of unease. Music swelled from a hidden ensemble, a haunting combination of strings and woodwinds that seemed almost alive, punctuating the conversation and laughter with notes that resonated deep in the chest. The hall itself seemed to respond. Shadows deepened in corners, mirrors reflected movements before they occurred, and the air felt thick as if it had memory. The host's attention was constant, a predator's patience veiled behind charm. He made small gestures, subtle manipulations, raising a glass to incite rivalry, mentioning a long-forgotten slight to awaken old grudges, or placing a dish in a way that forced an uncomfortable interaction. Guests, unaware of the psychological choreography, responded in ways that furthered the night's delicate tension. As the courses continued, the conversation grew sharper. Compliments were laced with condescension, toasts carried veiled threats, and even laughter could be read as challenge or mockery. The host watched with quiet fascination as human behavior unfolded, as civility began to strain under the weight of ambition, envy, and fear. The audience is made aware that this banquet is more than a meal. It is an experiment, a deliberate orchestration to observe how restraint and social order unravel under pressure. Every detail, the flick of a hand, the placement of a chair, the clink of silverware, was part of the host's silent design. By the time the main course was served, a subtle shift had occurred. The opulence of the room, once awe-inspiring, now felt suffocating. Guests began to glance nervously at one another, the elegance of the setting contrasting sharply with an almost primal sense of unease. Whispers started to circulate. Who could be trusted? Who might be plotting? Who had been slighted or insulted? The air was charged with anticipation, a mix of desire and fear that made even the most confident guest hesitate before speaking. The banquet, for all its beauty, had begun to reveal the darker currents of human nature lurking beneath social etiquette. Amid the lavish food and sparkling conversation, small incidents foreshadowed the coming chaos. A misplaced dish, a sudden burst of laughter, a guest spilling wine on another's attire. All were magnified in the tense atmosphere, their significance heightened by the mansion's weight and the host's deliberate orchestration. Each act, each interaction, was a thread in a growing tapestry of suspense, weaving together the human instincts that would later erupt in unimaginable horror. By the end of this section, the audience is fully immersed. They can almost hear the clinking of goblets, smell the rich aromas, feel the subtle tension in every glance and gesture. The banquet has begun in perfection, yet beneath the surface, the seeds of madness are sown, and the first ripples of chaos quietly stir. The scene is set for the descent that will follow, leaving viewers simultaneously mesmerized by opulence and uneasy with the invisible threat that hangs over every perfectly arranged detail of the feast. As the banquet progressed, the first subtle signs of unease began to ripple through the room, almost imperceptible at first, easily dismissed as nerves or the strain of social performance. A guest laughed too sharply at a joke. Another's hand lingered too long on a goblet, as if searching for courage. The host observed each micro-expression with the precision of a surgeon, noting the slightest twitch of a lip, the faintest narrowing of an eye, the imperceptible stiffening of posture. It was as though he were conducting an orchestra, but the instruments were human instincts, fear, envy, pride, and desire, and the symphony he sought would crescendo in chaos. Small tensions began to surface among the guests. Rivalries, once dormant, sparked in the subtlest of interactions, a toast taken as insult, a compliment perceived as mockery. Guests exchanged glances loaded with unspoken accusations. Words meant to be polite twisted into barbs under the weight of suspicion. The audience feels this creeping dread. Civility is fragile, and the veneer of elegance is already starting to crack. The laughter that had once filled the hall now seemed hollow, brittle, as though the walls themselves were aware that this night would not proceed as any ordinary gathering would. The psychological pressure mounted in small, almost imperceptible ways. A misplaced dish or a slight delay in service became an unbearable slight to some, a spark for long-buried grudges. Mirrors lining the walls reflected distorted images of guests, elongating their forms, exaggerating gestures, and subtly feeding their growing paranoia. Shadows pooled in corners, twisting and bending in ways that seemed unnatural, making the room itself feel alive, complicit in the unraveling of human reason. Even the music, once soothing and harmonious, began to feel discordant, each note striking nerves rather than calming them, amplifying tension. By the mid-course of the meal, a noticeable shift had begun. Conversations became sharper, the laughter less genuine. Guests who had entered with confidence now questioned their neighbors' motives, interpreting minor gestures as threats. A hand resting too long on the back of a chair could be read as a challenge. A smile might conceal scorn. The host, ever watchful, subtly stoked these insecurities with carefully placed words, rhetorical flourishes, and veiled reminders of past transgressions. Every detail was deliberate, a psychological tinderbox waiting for the smallest spark to ignite. Food, once a symbol of indulgence and pleasure, now took on a darker dimension. The rich aromas, intoxicating at first, began to feel oppressive, almost overwhelming. The textures and tastes that had seemed exquisite now seemed heavier, burdening the senses as though the act of consumption itself was a trap. Some guests felt a gnawing anxiety between bites, an inexplicable tension that made each swallow a small act of courage. The audience begins to sense that the banquet is no longer merely a display of wealth. It has become a pressure chamber, testing human instinct and restraint. Odd behaviors began to manifest, subtle at first, but increasingly alarming. A guest whispered frantically to another, only to be met with suspicion and a cold glare. Another fiddled obsessively with a utensil, twisting it between fingers as if warding off an unseen terror. Laughter erupted in sudden, incongruous bursts, moments of hysteria masquerading as humor. Each action, each misstep, heightened the tension, and the host observed with clinical interest, noting which individuals might break first, which could be manipulated, and which would spiral into fear-fueled violence. Even the environment seemed complicit. Windows rattled in the chill wind, doors creaked, and a draft carried a faint, inexplicable scent, like smoke or incense, that unsettled the guests further. Candle flames danced violently despite the absence of breeze, casting grotesque shadows that moved independently of their sources. These subtle disturbances, whether natural or orchestrated, reinforced the growing sense that the mansion itself was alive, feeding off the rising anxiety and amplifying the psychological strain on all who dared enter. By the close of this section, the stage is set for irreversible chaos. Guests, though still outwardly composed, teeter on the edge of reason. Civility has begun to fracture, suspicion and fear now permeating every glance and gesture. The audience feels the tension acutely, aware that what began as subtle unease will soon escalate into confrontation, panic, and ultimately, the horrific unraveling that the host has been carefully orchestrating from the very beginning. The mansion, the host, and the guests are now entwined in a delicate and terrifying dance, each step bringing them closer to the abyss. The moment of rupture began subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if the mansion itself had held its breath, waiting for the first spark to ignite. It started with a minor argument, a trivial disagreement over seating, a dish, or a toast, yet in the charged atmosphere of the banquet, it escalated with alarming speed. Voices, once carefully modulated in polite social cadence, rose and fell like waves, carrying accusation and thinly veiled malice. Guests who had been laughing moments before now cast wary glances, their hands trembling not from hunger, but from the mounting tension that seemed to saturate the very air. The audience is drawn into the transformation, from elegance to unease, from anticipation to fear. The stage is set for human civility to crumble. The host, ever observant, watched from his elevated position at the head of the table, a faint smile playing on his lips. He did nothing overt. His power was subtler, psychological. By carefully allowing minor conflicts to surface, by letting suspicions fester, he orchestrated an environment in which every action, no matter how small, could become a catalyst for chaos. A spilled glass of wine, a slight mispronunciation, the accidental brushing of a shoulder, all became potent triggers, amplified by the atmosphere, the mansion, and the carefully curated assembly of guests. It was as if the very walls conspired, magnifying tension until reason itself began to falter. As the argument escalated, the line between civility and primal instinct began to blur. Guests shouted, some gesturing wildly, others frozen in shock, their faces pale and eyes wide. The laughter and music of the banquet that had once filled the room now seemed grotesque. The notes of the harpsichord discordant, the shadows of the chandeliers elongating unnaturally. The opulence of the feast, once awe-inspiring, now contrasted horrifically with the unfolding disorder, turning the richness of the banquet into a grotesque theater of human weakness. The audience feels the shock, the disbelief, and the creeping dread. Elegance has been replaced by unpredictability, ritual by raw, unfiltered emotion. Panic began to ripple through the room, small at first, spreading like a contagion. Guests who had prided themselves on composure began to shout, to accuse, to threaten. Alliances formed and dissolved in seconds. Rivalries long buried, now bursting into full view. The subtle tensions that had simmered for hours erupted in moments of hysteria. Chairs were overturned, goblets clattered to the floor, and the smell of spilt wine mingled with the heady aromas of the feast, creating a sensory overload that heightened the psychological strain. The audience can almost hear the chaos, the shouts, the screams, the clinking of silverware, and feel the suffocating heat of fear and desperation that had begun to consume the hall. In the chaos, the mansion itself seemed to awaken. Windows rattled as though echoing the screams, doors banged in sudden gusts, and shadows twisted across walls and ceilings, appearing to move independently. Mirrors reflected not only the actions of the guests, but seemed to distort them, elongating limbs, exaggerating gestures, and turning expressions of fear into grotesque caricatures. The atmosphere was no longer just tense. It was alive with menace, a tangible presence that pressed down on every guest. The audience feels that the house is a silent accomplice, amplifying fear, magnifying paranoia, and heightening the sense that the night has become something otherworldly. Amid the frenzy, some guests tried to restore order, their voices trembling as they attempted to calm the increasingly frenzied crowd. But reason was no match for the psychological pressure that had built over the evening. Trust had evaporated. Suspicion dominated every glance. Even friends turned against one another, interpreting minor gestures as threats and minor insults as mortal challenges. The host observed silently, cataloging behaviors, noting who would succumb first to panic, who would lash out, and who would spiral into madness. Each moment was a revelation, an exploration of human instincts stripped bare by fear and survival. The banquet, initially an expression of civility and refinement, had transformed into a stage for the rawest aspects of human nature. Hunger, fear, and rivalry became intertwined, shaping actions that were unthinkable just hours before. The audience is drawn into the horror. Every act of aggression, every stolen glance, every whispered accusation now feels charged with meaning. What had begun as a sophisticated social performance has collapsed into chaos, exposing the fragile veneer of civilization, the primal instincts lurking beneath. In these moments, the narrative shifts dramatically. The first acts of physical violence erupted, minor at first. A shove here, a strike there, but enough to signal that the guests were no longer constrained by etiquette. Panic spread in waves, with each gesture of aggression provoking further violence. The previously orderly hall descended into a cacophony of screams, crashes, and the unmistakable sounds of fear-fed chaos. The audience experiences the descent, the transition from social spectacle to survival, from refinement to brutality. By the close of this section, the banquet has irrevocably changed. Civility is gone, replaced by fear, suspicion, and a growing sense of primal desperation. The host, ever calculating, watches as his experiment reaches critical mass, the forces he has subtly unleashed now moving beyond his control, or perhaps exactly as he intended. For the audience, the scene is both mesmerizing and terrifying, a perfect storm of human behavior under extreme pressure, foreshadowing the even darker acts that will follow. The shift from chaos to carnage, from fear to a horrifying surrender to instinct. By the time the first act of true horror unfolded, the banquet hall had become unrecognizable. The grandeur of the evening, the sparkling chandeliers, polished silverware, and meticulously arranged platters, was drowned beneath a rising tide of chaos and fear. Screams and shouts echoed against the walls, the air thick with the scent of spilt wine, burnt candle wax, and something far more primal, the unmistakable metallic tang of blood. In those moments, the civilized masks of the guests shattered completely. Fear and desperation had overpowered reason, and what had been a performance of etiquette and power now dissolved into raw survival. The first acts of cannibalism were almost accidental, or so some accounts suggest, born of panic, hunger, and an instinctual urge to dominate. A guest, seized by delirium or madness, struck another with a blunt object, and in the ensuing confusion, Others joined in, turning the room into a theater of unbridled violence. What had begun as aggression quickly escalated, a chain reaction fueled by terror, primal instinct, and the warped logic of survival. Screams mingled with laughter twisted by hysteria, a symphony of chaos that reflected the total collapse of social order. The audience feels the horror building. The transition from fear to physical predation is as shocking as it is inevitable, given the psychological pressures meticulously cultivated by the host. The mansion itself seemed to react, its walls amplifying every noise, every gasp, every cry of pain. Shadows stretched and twisted along the frescoed ceilings, elongating limbs and exaggerating gestures into grotesque parodies of the guests' actions. Mirrors reflected the carnage, doubling the horror and heightening the sense that the room was alive, an entity feeding off the madness unfolding within it. The audience is drawn not only into the acts themselves, but into the suffocating atmosphere. The mingling of fear, heat, and the overpowering stench of blood and fear. Every sense is assaulted. The opulence of the setting has become a cruel backdrop for acts of unimaginable depravity. Each participant's descent into savagery was different. Some were driven by sheer terror, their minds unraveling in the face of overwhelming chaos. Others acted with deliberate cruelty, seizing the moment to exert power over rivals, enemies, or those they had long envied. The host observed silently, cataloging behaviors, noting how hunger, fear, and superstition interwove to strip away the last vestiges of civility. The audience begins to comprehend the deliberate nature of his orchestration. This was not merely an accident, not merely a lapse into madness. It was the culmination of hours of psychological manipulation, a carefully constructed collapse of human decorum. The scenes of violence and cannibalism were punctuated by moments of surreal horror. A guest might pause mid-act, horror washing over their face, only to be overcome again by desperation. Screams would give way to laughter, and laughter would spiral into sobs. In the midst of the chaos, some tried to reason, to plead, to escape, but the mansion's labyrinthine corridors, the host's subtle orchestration, and the sheer panic of the group made flight impossible. The room had become both a cage and a crucible, amplifying every fear and desire, forcing the guests to confront the darkest aspects of their own nature. Accounts describe the scene with a mixture of disbelief and revulsion. Plumes of wine and blood mixed in a grotesque mosaic across the marble floors. Tables once adorned with fine foods were overturned, and the remnants of dishes lay scattered amidst the chaos. Servants, silent and watchful earlier in the evening, now disappeared into the shadows, leaving the guests alone to their instincts. The audience is confronted with the duality of human behavior. The same individuals who had laughed, toasted, and admired the elegance of the evening were now driven by base survival instincts, preying upon one another with horrifying efficiency. Cultural taboos amplify the terror of these acts. Cannibalism, historically and universally, has represented a final crossing of moral and societal boundaries. The Banquet's descent into such depravity was a violation not only of the rules of etiquette, but of the very foundations of human decency. The host, fully aware of these implications, seemed to manipulate these instincts with the precision of a conductor, testing limits and observing the complete collapse of moral constraints. The audience is left to wrestle with both fascination and repulsion, as the horror is heightened by the recognition that these acts, while extreme, arise from impulses that exist, however dormant, in all humans under extreme pressure. The psychological horror intertwined with the physical. Fear spread contagiously. Suspicion and paranoia reached their apex. No one could be trusted. Allies turned on one another with sudden violence. Old grudges exploded with devastating speed, and each act of cannibalism became both a survival tactic and a terrifying declaration of dominance. Shadows twisted grotesquely in the firelight, echoing the moral distortion within each guest. Every corner of the hall, every table, Every corridor seemed alive with menace, amplifying the sense that the guests were trapped in a nightmare that was both orchestrated and inevitable. Folklore and superstition, which had lingered like subtle undertones throughout the night, now erupted into full awareness. Guests whispered of curses, omens, and ancestral wrath. Some cried out in terror, fearing they were the next victims of a family curse, while others rationalized the chaos as madness unleashed by hunger and fear. The blending of superstition with visceral reality created a surreal, almost otherworldly atmosphere, a hallucinatory landscape where morality, civility, and reality itself became fluid. For the audience, this reinforces the horror. The line between human and monstrous behavior has not only blurred, it has been obliterated. By the close of this section, the banquet has irrevocably become a theater of horror. What had begun as a feast celebrating wealth and social prowess has transformed into an arena of human depravity, driven by fear, hunger, and manipulation. The host's experiment, if it can be called that, has reached its terrifying zenith. Civility destroyed, morality abandoned, and human instincts laid bare in their most horrifying form. The audience is left gasping, not only at the acts themselves, but at the chilling realization of how quickly the veneer of civilization can crumble under pressure, leaving only raw, primal behavior in its place. When the final echoes of screams faded, a horrifying silence settled over the mansion, heavier than any sound that had preceded it. The grandeur of the banquet hall, the chandeliers, the polished floors, the overturned tables, remained, but it was now a grotesque stage upon which human civility had been utterly annihilated. Blood-streaked floors reflected flickering candlelight like cruel mirrors, amplifying the magnitude of the night's atrocities. The room, once a symbol of wealth and elegance, now seemed to breathe with a life of its own, saturated with horror, fear, and the unspoken knowledge of what had transpired. The guests, those who remained, were no longer the same people who had arrived hours earlier. Faces that had smiled and conversed with refined composure were now twisted by trauma, guilt, and exhaustion. Some sat frozen, staring at the carnage in disbelief, while others roamed the room in dazed confusion, unable to comprehend the acts they had committed or witnessed. The air was thick with the stench of blood, wine, and sweat, a sensory reminder that the night had crossed every boundary of civility and morality. It was a silence that pressed on the mind, heavy and suffocating, leaving survivors caught between relief that the madness had ended and terror that it might rise again. The host, the orchestrator of this night of depravity, remained at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. To the audience, it is clear that his intentions, whether purely experimental or sadistically indulgent, had been realized. He surveyed the aftermath with a clinical detachment, cataloging behaviors, reactions, and the consequences of his careful manipulation. The mansion had absorbed the chaos, its architecture and atmosphere amplifying every fear and instinct, leaving behind a tableau of destruction that would be remembered and whispered about for generations. Survivors attempted to process what had occurred. Some were paralyzed by guilt, their minds replaying every act, every scream, every desperate face of a fellow guest turned adversary. Others sought to rationalize their behavior, convincing themselves that survival had left no alternative. Whispers of blame spread quickly, alliances shattered, and suspicion lingered like a shadow over the ruined hall. No one could be trusted. Everyone had been complicit, whether by action or inaction. The audience feels the weight of this realization. The psychological aftermath of the banquet is as harrowing as the physical acts themselves. Outside the mansion, word of the night's events began to seep into the surrounding area, carried by the few who fled or stumbled away. The local villagers, already aware of the mansion's dark reputation, were horrified but not entirely surprised. Tales of curses, madness, and ancestral sins suddenly found terrifying confirmation. News spread like wildfire, leaving a mark not only on the survivors, but on the wider community, embedding the banquet into local folklore as a cautionary tale of wealth, power, and the fragility of human decency. The audience is drawn into the ripple effect. The horror is no longer contained within the walls of the mansion. It extends into the consciousness of an entire society. The physical aftermath mirrored the psychological chaos. Tables remained overturned, plates shattered, and furniture was splintered from the frenzy of violence. Blood had soaked into the wood and stone, leaving stains that would remain as grim reminders for generations. Candles still burned, their flames flickering against walls streaked with shadow and reflection, turning the scene into a grotesque painting of civilization undone. The mansion itself seemed almost sanctified in its horror, a permanent witness to the collapse of social order and human morality, leaving viewers with a lingering sense of unease long after the description fades. Emotional trauma among the survivors manifested in different ways. Some wept openly, collapsing in despair, their bodies trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and horror. Others remained silent, staring blankly, as if the mind had severed connection to the events in a desperate bid for self-preservation. Memory itself became unreliable, fragments of the night replayed in nightmarish loops, blending acts of violence with surreal moments of confusion and terror. The audience senses that the true horror of the banquet is not only in the acts themselves, but in the permanent psychological scars they left behind. Even after the immediate chaos ended, fear persisted. Guests who had not fled remained haunted by the unpredictability of human nature, the fragility of social norms, and the realization that civility is a thin veneer, easily shattered under pressure. Rumors began to emerge that some of the host's methods, psychological manipulation, environmental cues, and perhaps even subtle poisons, had contributed to the guests' descent into madness. Historians would later debate the extent of these influences, but for the audience, the lingering uncertainty amplifies the night's horror, leaving an impression that the mansion, the host, and the human psyche had combined to create a perfect storm of terror. By the end of this section, the banquet is etched in memory not just as a grotesque spectacle, but as a psychological study of human vulnerability. The physical carnage is horrific, yet the emotional and societal repercussions are equally devastating. The audience is left suspended between fascination and revulsion, understanding that the aftermath of this night extends far beyond the mansion itself. Fear, guilt, and suspicion linger like ghosts, haunting survivors and shaping the legends that will persist for generations, a grim testament to the darkness that lies beneath even the most refined veneer of society. The morning after the banquet, the mansion seemed almost deceptively calm. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating a scene that could barely be described as a room at all. Debris from the previous night, the overturned tables, shattered plates, and streaks of blood, glinted in the light, casting a grotesque reflection of the horror that had unfolded. Servants and locals, summoned by the whispers of neighbors and the few survivors who had escaped, cautiously entered the mansion. Their reactions ranged from silent horror to audible gasps, as the true scale of what had occurred became undeniable. The audience is drawn into the contrast, the serene beauty of a sunlit hall against the lingering evidence of chaos and carnage. Historians and chroniclers of the time later pieced together accounts of the banquet, relying on survivor testimonies, local rumors, and the sparse records kept by the host himself. These accounts varied widely, some emphasizing the psychological breakdown of the guests, others detailing the acts of violence and cannibalism in horrifying clarity. The discrepancies between accounts only heightened the sense of mystery and dread surrounding the event. The audience is encouraged to sense that history itself, like memory, can be fractured, each version carrying a slightly different horror, each reflection amplifying the night's infamy. Survivor testimonies painted a picture of disbelief and terror. Many described a feeling of inevitability, as though the events had been predestined by the mansion, the host, or some unseen force. They spoke of small tensions that had escalated with terrifying speed, of glances and gestures interpreted as mortal threats, of whispered accusations and sudden panic. Some claim to have glimpsed shadows moving independently of any light source, or to have heard voices that seemed not to belong to any guest. While skeptics dismissed such accounts as hysteria, the patterns in the testimonies were consistent enough to suggest that the mansion, combined with the host's manipulation, had created an environment in which reality itself became unstable. Local villagers, already familiar with tales of curses and ancestral misdeeds, recorded their own accounts of the aftermath. They spoke of guests fleeing into the streets, bloodied, screaming, or completely silent, their eyes wide with shock. Some described lingering disturbances in the mansion, doors that slammed without wind, flickering lights, and an oppressive air that seemed to resist entry. These accounts were woven into folklore almost immediately, adding layers of superstition to the historical record. The audience begins to perceive that the line between fact and legend is intentionally blurred, reinforcing the narrative that the banquet was as much a psychological and supernatural phenomenon as it was a historical event. Investigations, formal and informal, began almost immediately. Local authorities attempted to piece together the events, interviewing survivors and examining the scene. Yet their efforts were hampered by the mansion's complexity and the sheer scale of the horror. Many guests refused to speak fully, either out of shame, fear, or lingering trauma. Those who did testify often contradicted one another, recalling details that range from subtle behavioral shifts to grotesque acts of cannibalism. Scholars later debated these discrepancies, interpreting them as evidence of trauma, manipulation, or the host's premeditated psychological influence. For the audience, this creates tension between what is known and what is imagined, between documented history and human perception. The host himself played a peculiar role in the historical record. Some accounts suggest he offered careful explanations to authorities, presenting himself as a concerned observer rather than an instigator. He maintained the image of sophistication and control, even as the evidence of chaos and death mounted. This added a chilling layer to the story. The orchestrator of horror appearing composed, detached, and perhaps entirely unrepentant. The audience senses the duality of the host, both a master manipulator and a figure whose moral compass, or lack thereof, remains an enduring mystery. Chroniclers noted the long-term psychological effects on the surviving guests. Many were never the same again, haunted by memories of acts they had committed or witnessed. Some withdrew from society entirely, others descended into madness, and a few attempted to rationalize the events as extraordinary, external forces at play. The banquet became a case study in the fragility of human civility, demonstrating how social order could unravel when psychological pressure, fear, and primal instincts intersected with opportunity and manipulation. The audience is drawn to consider the deeper implications. The night was not merely a horrific spectacle, but a profound exploration of human nature under extreme stress. The cultural legacy of the banquet was immediate and enduring. The mansion, previously a symbol of wealth and refinement, became a locus of fear and superstition. Travelers were warned to avoid it. Local legends grew in scale and horror, and the story of the night became intertwined with discussions of morality, power, and human instinct. Over generations, retellings varied in detail, some emphasizing the cannibalism, others focusing on psychological manipulation or supernatural suggestions, but all maintained the same sense of dread. The banquet transcended its immediate context, entering folklore as a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition, human fragility, and the dark consequences of curiosity and desire. Even centuries later, historians, paranormal investigators, and storytellers revisit the event, drawn by the combination of historical documentation, survivor testimony, and legend. They analyze the psychological mechanisms at play, the role of environmental cues, and the cultural factors that contributed to the night's descent into madness. Each retelling highlights a different aspect. Some emphasize the cruelty of the host, others the fragility of human morality, and still others the supernatural undertones embedded in the mansion's architecture and the guest experiences. For the audience, this reinforces the sense that the banquet is not simply history. It is a living story, continuously interpreted and reinterpreted, whose horror persists across generations. By the end of this section, the audience understands that the banquet's significance extends far beyond the immediate acts of violence and cannibalism. It is a study in human behavior, a cautionary tale of power and psychological manipulation, and a legend that blends history with folklore. The investigation and historical accounts serve not only to document, but to magnify the horror, leaving the audience with a lingering sense of dread and fascination, aware that this night of indulgence, fear, and depravity remains etched into the collective consciousness, impossible to fully comprehend, yet impossible to ignore. The surviving guests left the mansion physically intact, but mentally shattered, their minds forever marked by the horrors they had witnessed or committed. Many spoke of nights plagued by nightmares so vivid they could feel the weight of bloodied hands, hear the screams echoing endlessly, and see faces contorted by fear, hatred, and desperation. Sleep became a battleground, each attempt at rest disrupted by the relentless replay of chaos, violence, and the horrifying collapse of civility. The audience is drawn into the psychological aftermath, realizing that while the banquet ended, the true horror had only begun, a lifelong descent into trauma and obsession. Some survivors experienced profound paranoia. They became distrustful of friends, family, and strangers alike, seeing subtle gestures as potential threats, much as they had learned to do in the mansion. Ordinary social interactions became unbearable, as every conversation or glance carried the weight of potential betrayal. Their own memories became suspect, fragmented by shock and fear, leaving them uncertain of what had truly occurred versus what had been imagined in the frenzy of panic. The audience senses that the banquet's terror was not confined to the night itself. It had infiltrated the very consciousness of its witnesses. Guilt weighed heavily on many. Survivors who had acted violently or even participated in the cannibalistic frenzy were haunted by their own deeds. Some withdrew entirely from society, wandering in isolation, speaking little, consumed by shame and the constant replay of choices made under duress. Others sought redemption through acts of extreme piety or charitable devotion, attempting to atone for sins they could scarcely comprehend. The banquet became not merely an event in their past, but a moral crucible, forcing each survivor to reckon with the darkest capacities of their own nature. Some accounts describe complete psychological breakdown. Survivors became trapped in cycles of hysteria and mania, hallucinating the figures of those they had lost or consumed, wandering the halls, reaching out for revenge. In some cases, they reported seeing shadows in mirrors or flickers of movement in empty corners, convinced the mansion itself had claimed part of their soul. The line between reality and delusion blurred, reinforcing the mansion's eerie presence even after their departure. For the audience, this emphasizes the insidious power of trauma. The psychological scars of that night became as permanent and haunting as the physical devastation. A few survivors documented their experiences in writing, producing letters, diaries, or accounts that would later be analyzed by historians and psychologists. These documents describe the gradual erosion of trust, the sense of being watched, and the inability to reconcile civilized behavior with the acts they had been driven to commit. Some accounts included detailed descriptions of psychological manipulation by the host, small provocations, strategic placement, and the careful escalation of fear and hunger. The audience begins to understand that the banquet was not merely a night of chaos, but a meticulously orchestrated experiment in the fragility of human morality and restraint. Family and community members of the survivors also bore the weight of the trauma. Those who returned home brought with them a haunted presence, a lingering dread that seemed to infect daily life. Relationships strained under the weight of unspoken horrors. Survivors often struggled to articulate the experience, finding words inadequate to convey the intensity of fear, guilt, and shame. Some communities ostracized them, unable to comprehend or forgive the behavior, while others treated them as cautionary examples, reinforcing the mansion's story as both legend and moral warning. The audience perceives that the banquet's consequences extended far beyond the walls of the mansion, shaping society's perception of morality, madness, and human potential for depravity. Psychologists, historians, and folklorists later analyzed these accounts, noting recurring patterns of trauma. Flashbacks, nightmares, paranoia, and social withdrawal were common. Some survivors suffered permanent neurological effects, unable to function in ordinary society. Others became obsessed with the night itself, documenting every detail, retracing the mansion's corridors, or obsessively collecting artifacts and stories. For the audience, this reinforces a chilling truth. The banquet's horror was not confined to a single night. It created ripples of trauma that would echo across lifetimes, shaping behavior and consciousness long after the event itself. The interplay of fear, guilt, and societal pressure created a unique psychological environment. Survivors were trapped between the reality of what had occurred and the collective horror imposed by the wider community. Rumors amplified their guilt, and societal judgment ensured that memories could not fade. Those who had survived the physical danger now faced relentless social and emotional scrutiny, further eroding their mental stability. The audience experiences this as a continuation of the night's psychological manipulation, now extended across years and decades, illustrating the long-term consequences of extreme human behavior under pressure. By the end of this section, the audience is left with an understanding of the profound, enduring human cost of the banquet. The psychological trauma endured by survivors highlights the fragility of the mind when confronted with extreme stress, fear, and moral collapse. The night's events transcended physical horror, embedding themselves into the psyche of those who witnessed it. The banquet becomes not only a historical atrocity, but a case study in human vulnerability, trauma, and the haunting persistence of guilt and fear. The mansion, the host, and the events of that night remain alive in the memories of survivors, echoing through time as a grim reminder that human nature, when pushed to its limits, can descend into unimaginable darkness. Over the decades, the mansion and the banquet it hosted took on a life beyond the purely historical. It became a locus of folklore, whispered about in taverns and villages, a story passed down with each retelling growing darker, more surreal, more horrifying. The blood-streaked tables, shattered plates, and echoing screams became legend, symbols of humanity's fragile veneer of civility and the depths of depravity that could be reached when fear, hunger, and psychological manipulation converged. People spoke of the mansion as cursed, haunted by the spirits of both the victims and the perpetrators, a place where time itself seemed to twist and morality was suspended. The audience is drawn into the idea that the night's horrors were not confined to history, but became immortalized in the collective consciousness. Local traditions began to incorporate the mansion and its infamous banquet into tales of warning. Children were told stories of the host's meticulous cruelty, of the night when men and women turned on one another, abandoning every social and moral code. The mansion became a symbol, a cautionary emblem of ambition, greed, and curiosity unchecked by conscience. Even generations removed from the event, villagers claimed to see shadows flit across windows or hear faint laughter and whispering in empty halls, particularly on the anniversary of the banquet. These tales transformed the historical event into something larger, a legend that defied rational explanation, bridging the gap between human history and folklore. Writers and historians chronicled the banquet in varying degrees of detail. Some emphasized the psychological aspects, the meticulous orchestration by the host, the subtle manipulations, and the rapid unraveling of social order. Others focused on the gruesome, the cannibalism, the raw, primal instincts that overtook the guests. Over time, these narratives merged, blending history and horror, creating a story that was as moral parable as it was factual recounting. The audience begins to feel the weight of this blending. The Banquet is simultaneously a historical atrocity and a myth, a terrifying legend that challenges the boundary between reality and imagination. The mansion itself became a destination for those drawn to the macabre. Scholars, curiosity seekers, and even occult practitioners ventured inside, hoping to glimpse evidence of the past or understand the forces that had led to such madness. Some reported strange occurrences, unexplained cold drafts, footsteps echoing where no one walked, flickering lights, or objects moving without cause. Others described visions of figures replaying the night's horrors, as if the mansion preserved the memories of that catastrophic evening. The house became more than a building. It became an entity, a vessel of horror, amplifying fear and fascination. Paranormal investigators later claimed that the mansion harbored residual energies, what some called a psychic imprint of a night's events. They theorized that the extreme emotional intensity, the terror, panic, guilt, and violence had left traces within the walls, echoes that could be perceived centuries later. Visitors described chills, feelings of being watched, and sudden, inexplicable unease. Some claimed to hear whispers, faint cries, and even the sounds of tables and glass shattering, as though the mansion were replaying the Banquet in spectral form. The audience is left with the unsettling notion that the mansion is not merely haunted by legend, but by something more tangible, a lingering consciousness forged in horror. Folklore amplified the host's infamy. He became more than a man. He became a symbol of calculated cruelty, the embodiment of the danger of unchecked ambition and moral corruption. Stories described him as a figure both charming and terrifying, capable of inspiring loyalty, fear, or both simultaneously. In some accounts, he was said to walk among shadows, orchestrating events even after death, his presence felt by those who dared enter the mansion. The legend elevated him from historical figure to near mythical manipulator, a character whose intelligence and cruelty transcended time and whose actions continued to affect all who learned of the Banquet. Artists and storytellers contributed to the legacy as well. Paintings depicted the Banquet's chaos in dramatic tableaus, capturing both the horror and the grotesque beauty of the hall. Literary works reimagined the night as moral allegory, exploring the fragility of human civility under extreme circumstances. Later, films and visual media drew upon the accounts, blending historical reconstruction with creative interpretation, emphasizing the suspense, psychological tension, and eventual descent into primal horror. The audience experiences the Banquet not just as a historical event, but as a cultural touchstone that has inspired fascination, fear, and artistic exploration for centuries. Legends also intertwined with the local landscape. Villagers spoke of pathways to the mansion where travelers would feel sudden cold or experience sudden disorientation. Some claimed that certain rooms or corridors replayed moments of the Banquet, with ghostly figures frozen in time, endlessly reenacting acts of betrayal, fear, and violence. The mansion became a mirror reflecting both the historical atrocities and the collective fears of those who lived nearby. In folklore, it represented the idea that human cruelty could leave a permanent mark, not just on individuals, but on the very places where acts of horror occurred. Even centuries later, historians debated the veracity of some claims. Were the supernatural occurrences exaggerated by fearful imaginations? Did the mansion really preserve a psychic residue of a night? Or was it simply the human tendency to mythologize trauma and horror? Yet, for all skepticism, the core truths remained. The Banquet had occurred, the acts had been committed, and its effects on survivors, communities, and culture were undeniable. The audience is compelled to confront the blend of fact, interpretation, and legend that gives the story its enduring power and unsettling allure. The Banquet's legacy also became a moral touchstone. Scholars and storytellers emphasized lessons about human nature, the ease with which social norms can crumble under fear and hunger, the fragility of morality when subjected to manipulation, and the capacity for cruelty lurking beneath civility. The mansion, the host, and the guests became archetypes in stories of moral caution, illustrating how ambition, pride, and psychological manipulation could provoke unimaginable horror. For the audience, this elevates the tale from mere historical curiosity to a timeless meditation on the dark potential of humanity. By the end of this section, the Banquet's historical and folkloric legacy is fully realized. The mansion, the host, and the events of that night exist both as a documented atrocity and as a living legend, echoing through generations. It is a story that continues to captivate, terrify, and provoke reflection on human behavior, morality, and the potential for darkness that lies within all of us. The audience is left with a chilling sense that the horror has not been contained by history, but continues to resonate, a haunting that transcends time, culture, and even rational understanding. In modern times, the mansion and its infamous banquet have attracted a new kind of attention. Scholars, psychologists, and paranormal investigators alike have attempted to piece together the fragments of history, folklore, and witness accounts to understand what truly occurred. Unlike the early chroniclers, contemporary observers approach the story with tools of science and analysis. Yet the mansion retains its power to confound and terrify. Visitors report an almost palpable tension, an atmosphere thick with the echoes of fear, guilt, and primal instinct, suggesting that the legacy of the night persists in ways that cannot be entirely explained by psychology or legend alone. Historians revisiting the event focus on the socio-cultural context. They examine the wealth, power, and social hierarchies that brought such a gathering into being, and how these factors contributed to the psychological pressures that led to catastrophe. Some theorists argue that the host's careful orchestration of the evening, a combination of environmental control, social manipulation, and psychological provocation, was a deliberate experiment, a study of human nature under extreme conditions. Others suggest a darker interpretation, that the host enjoyed the suffering and moral collapse, turning the banquet into a stage for cruelty as much as curiosity. The audience is drawn to consider the duality. Was it science, sadism, or a combination of both that drove the night to its horrific conclusion? Psychologists have analyzed survivor testimonies and historical accounts, seeking to understand the rapid descent into violence and cannibalism. The phenomenon of group hysteria, combined with fear, hunger, and social pressure, created an environment where ordinary moral codes were suspended. Each action by the guests, every shove, every accusation, every act of aggression, was magnified by the surrounding chaos, reinforcing panic and primal instincts. Modern interpretations suggest that the host's manipulation of tension, combined with the architecture of the mansion and the psychological profiles of the guests, created a perfect storm in which reason and civility were all but impossible to maintain. The audience begins to recognize the calculated intersection of environment and human behavior, a timeless study in social psychology gone horrifically wrong. Paranormal investigators, on the other hand, focus on the lingering presence of the mansion itself. They report unusual phenomena, sudden drops in temperature, the feeling of unseen eyes watching, fleeting shadows in peripheral vision, and unexplained sounds reminiscent of the chaos of the banquet. Some visitors claim to have experienced visions of figures frozen mid-action, replaying moments of fear, violence, and cannibalism. Whether these experiences are interpreted as supernatural or psychological, they reinforce the mansion's reputation as a place where the past refuses to remain buried, a location where history, memory, and legend collide. For the audience, this creates an eerie tension between empirical observation and unexplainable phenomena, a reminder that the night's horror has left an indelible imprint on reality itself. Modern storytellers, including filmmakers, writers, and podcasters, have further cemented the banquet in public imagination. Documentaries reconstruct the night, blending historical records, survivor accounts, and expert analysis, while horror writers embellish or reinterpret the events, emphasizing psychological tension and the grotesque collapse of social order. Each retelling highlights different facets: the meticulous orchestration of the host, the sudden eruption of primal instincts, the lingering supernatural undertones, or the societal and psychological consequences. The Banquet has become a cultural touchstone, a narrative that explores the fragility of morality, the limits of civility, and the darkness lurking beneath wealth, refinement, and human pretense. Some contemporary historians have attempted to separate fact from folklore. They compare survivor accounts, official records, and architectural studies of the mansion to piece together a coherent timeline. While discrepancies abound, some details exaggerated or altered through retelling, common threads emerge. The precision of the host's manipulation, the rapid escalation of fear, and the ultimate collapse of human morality in the hall. These analyses suggest that while supernatural elements may be interpretive or metaphorical, the psychological reality of the night was catastrophic. The audience is reminded that real horror often emerges not from myth alone, but from the human capacity for fear, cruelty, and survival under extreme conditions. Paranormal researchers often collaborate with historians, documenting electrical anomalies, temperature fluctuations, and other phenomena in the mansion. Some claim to have captured audio and visual evidence that hints at residual energy from the events, a psychic imprint left by extreme emotional and physical trauma. Others are more skeptical, attributing unusual readings to architectural quirks, acoustics, or the human imagination. Yet, even skeptics cannot fully deny the mansion's ability to evoke terror, unease, and fascination in every visitor, suggesting that the legacy of the Banquet transcends simple rational explanation. For the audience, this tension between scientific investigation and unexplainable experience heightens the mystery, creating a narrative that is both historical and spectral. The mansion has also become a site for ethical and philosophical discussion. Scholars debate questions of human nature, morality, and societal fragility. Could such a breakdown occur today? What role does social pressure, manipulation, and fear play in human behavior? Does the legend serve as a cautionary tale, or as an example of humanity's potential for cruelty when deprived of norms and stability? The Banquet's enduring presence in modern discourse emphasizes its relevance. While the specifics belong to the past, the lessons, warnings, and moral reflections remain timeless. By the end of this section, the audience is left with a multi-layered understanding of the Banquet's modern legacy. It exists as history, folklore, psychological study, and paranormal phenomenon simultaneously. The mansion and its infamous host continue to fascinate, terrify, and provoke reflection on human behavior, morality, and the thin veneer separating civility from chaos. Contemporary interpretations, whether scientific, paranormal, or cultural, reinforce the night's enduring impact, ensuring that the story remains a compelling study of the extremes of fear, instinct, and human darkness. As the shadows lengthen across the centuries, the Banquet that ended in blood and horror remains an enduring reflection of humanity's potential for both refinement and savagery. The story begins with elegance and opulence, a display of wealth and power, yet it concludes with primal violence, chaos, and the ultimate collapse of social order. This final section draws the audience into a moment of reflection, bridging history, folklore, psychology, and the paranormal, highlighting the lessons that resonate far beyond the walls of the mansion. The Banquet is no longer simply an event. It is a mirror, reflecting the fragility of civilization and the thin veneer that separates order from chaos. The psychological and moral lessons of the Banquet are profound. It demonstrates that fear, hunger, and manipulation can override the most deeply ingrained social norms, pushing individuals to acts they would once have considered unthinkable. Even the most sophisticated, polite, and educated guests were not immune to the pressures exerted by environment, circumstance, and carefully orchestrated tension. Civility, morality, and trust, all foundational to society, proved to be fragile constructs, vulnerable to exploitation and collapse. The audience is invited to consider the uncomfortable truth. Under extreme conditions, human instincts can supersede ethics, revealing the latent darkness within us all. From a historical perspective, the banquet serves as a cautionary tale. The mansion, the host, and the guests became symbols of unchecked ambition, the dangers of indulgence, and the devastating consequences of manipulating human behavior. Historians argue that the events were not merely grotesque curiosities, but illustrative examples of the intersection of power, social hierarchy, and psychological pressure. The audience is challenged to think critically about the structures of society and how easily they can be destabilized, particularly when the stakes involve survival, desire, or manipulation by a calculating force. The folklore and legends surrounding the banquet enrich its meaning, emphasizing the interplay between memory, myth, and morality. Stories passed down through generations transform the mansion into more than a physical location. It becomes a symbol of caution, a repository of fear, and a narrative vessel for societal reflection. Tales of shadows, whispers, and residual energy elevate the banquet from historical record to moral allegory, ensuring that it remains both captivating and terrifying. By blending fact and legend, the story forces the audience to confront not just what happened, but what it means about human nature and our collective fascination with the macabre. The paranormal dimension adds another layer of reflection. Investigators' reports of unexplained phenomena, cold spots, apparitions, whispers, and inexplicable movements suggest that the mansion continues to harbor the echoes of its dark past. Whether interpreted as supernatural, psychological, or symbolic, these experiences reinforce the idea that extreme human behavior leaves traces that extend beyond time and mortality. The audience is reminded that some events resonate so profoundly that they refuse to be confined to history alone, lingering in architecture, memory, and cultural consciousness as haunting reminders of what transpired. Yet, amidst the horror, there is also insight. The banquet prompts questions about morality, choice, and responsibility. While the guests were driven by fear and hunger, they were also subject to manipulation and circumstance. The host, whether motivated by sadism, curiosity, or intellect, exploited these vulnerabilities with precision. This invites reflection on the ethical boundaries of power and the consequences of psychological manipulation, not only in historical context, but also in contemporary society. The audience is challenged to consider their own responses to pressure, fear, and manipulation, and how easily the line between civility and chaos can blur. Ultimately, the banquet is a story of contrasts: civilization versus savagery, reason versus instinct, order versus chaos. It is a tale of human fragility, yet also of fascination, the way we are drawn to understand, analyze, and retell moments when humanity is stripped to its core. By exploring the historical details, survivor accounts, psychological implications, folklore, and paranormal resonance, the audience gains a holistic understanding of the event's enduring power. It is both a warning and a mirror, compelling us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the potential darkness that lies beneath the surface of society. As the documentary draws to a close, the mansion itself becomes emblematic, a silent witness to centuries of horror, fear, and legend. Its walls, its corridors, and the very air of the place seem to embody the lessons of the banquet. That extremes of emotion, manipulation, and circumstance can unmask the most primal instincts within us. The audience is left with a lingering sense of awe, fear, and reflection, aware that the story is more than a historical oddity. It is an enduring meditation on morality, psychology, and the capacity for darkness inherent in all humans. In the final analysis, the banquet that ended with guests consuming one another is more than grotesque spectacle. It is a cautionary narrative, a psychological study, a folkloric legend, and a haunting legacy. Its story reminds us that civilization, morality, and social trust are constructs that require vigilance, empathy, and self-awareness. By understanding the events, the motivations, and the consequences, the audience emerges with a profound appreciation for the delicate balance between order and chaos, reason and instinct, humanity and monstrosity. The Banquet endures not simply because of its horror, but because it forces reflection on our choices, our vulnerabilities, and the thin line between the civilized world and the abyss beneath. In the shadows of the mansion, in the echoes of screams, and in the whispered legends, we confront a truth both timeless and unsettling. Under certain conditions, the darkest aspects of human nature can rise, and the consequences can echo through history, folklore, and memory, compelling us to watch, to learn, and to remember.